They don't give a shit about you if you are committing genocide, as long as it's on behalf of, quote, American interest. Sanctions have allowed U.S. governments to take moral, economically meaningful stance against perpetrators of war crimes. And yet, Reinsich said, nobody in the government is sure this whole strategy is even working.
Mike. I don't know who you are. I don't know where you are. But your name, wanna start changing your ways. Change.
This is crazy. There is a new article that just dropped in the Wall Street Journal. It's basically the U.S. is evil. How 4 U.S. presidents unleashed economic warfare across the globe. In Cuba, sanctions imposed by the United States more than 60 years ago have failed to dislodge the communist regime, but they've made it more difficult to get critical medical supplies to the island. In Iran, U.S. sanctions that date to the 70s have not forced out Tehran's theocratic rulers, but they have pushed the country to forge close alliances with Russia and China. In Syria, dictator Bashar al-Assad remains in power despite 20 years of U.S. sanctions, but the country is struggling to rebuild from civil war, and more Syrians than ever are expected to need critical humanitarian assistance this year. In country after country, sanctions have emerged as a key instrument of U.S. foreign policy. Now, chat, notice they never do sanctions on, like, you know, criminals that bankrupt Americans or steal from Americans. They don't give a shit about you if you are committing genocide, as long as it's on behalf of, quote, American interest. Today, the United States imposes 3 times as many sanctions as any other country or international body, targeting 1/3 of all nations with some kind of financial penalty on people, properties, or organizations. They have become an almost reflexive weapon in perpetual economic warfare, and their overuse is recognized at the highest levels of government, but American presidents find the tool increasingly irresistible. And nobody, like, legitimately, can you imagine if the United States was just like, we're lifting all sanctions? By cutting their targets off from the Western financial system, sanctions can crush national industries, erase personal fortunes, and upset the balance of political power in troublesome regions. All without putting a single American soldier in harm's way. But even as sanctions have proliferated, concern about their impact has grown. In Washington, the swell of sanctions has spawned a multi-billion-dollar industry. Yay! Oh, by the way, Washington Post reporter Max Boot's wife was just arrested for being an illegal fucking, I think she was a secret agent of the South Korean government. Foreign governments and multinational corporations spent exorbitant sums to influence the system, while white shoe law firms and K Street lobbying shops have built booming sanctions practices, in part by luring government officials to cash in on their expertise. Elsewhere, sanctions have pushed autocratic regimes into black market trade, empowering criminal networks and gangs of smugglers. U.S. adversaries are ramping up their efforts to work together to circumvent the financial penalties, and like military action, economic warfare can leave collateral damage. Sanctions on Venezuela, for instance, contributed to economic contraction roughly 3 times as large as that caused by the Great Depression in the United States. But it was socialism's fault, guys. Remember, it was socialism. It's because they wanted to give people health care. That's why their economy shrank. It wasn't the world superpower. It was socialism. Number of entities sanctioned and unsanctioned by the Office of Foreign Assets. Biden doing more sanctions than Trump. Thank God we vote for Democrats. The peace ticket. Sanctions, or even just the threat of them, can be an effective policy tool, a way to punish bad behavior or pressure an adversary without resorting to military force. Sanctions have allowed U.S. governments to take moral, economically meaningful stance against perpetrators of war crimes. They helped bring an end to South Africa's apartheid regime and contributed to the eventual overthrow of Serbian dictator Slobodan Milosevic. But even when they fail, proponents say, they can be preferable to the alternative, which might be doing nothing or going to war. Still, North Korea has been sanctioned for more than half a century without halting Pyongyang's efforts to acquire nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles. U.S. sanctions on Nicaragua have done little to deter the authoritarian regime of Daniel Ortega. Okay, dude. 2 years of sanctions on Russia over its invasion of Ukraine have degraded Moscow's long-term economic prospects and raised the cost of military production. But these sanctions have spawned a dark fleet of ships selling oil outside international regulation while bringing the Kremlin into closer alliance with Beijing. Alarm about sanctions rise has reached the highest levels of the U.S. government. Some senior administration officials have told President Biden directly that overuse of sanctions risks making the tool less valuable, which is exactly what's happened. They've sanctioned so many countries that it's like like half the population. I'm sorry, a third of the population. Those countries should just join together in common cause. And yet, despite recognition that the volume of sanctions may be excessive, U.S. officials tend to see each individual action as justified, making it hard to stop the trend. The United States is imposing sanctions at a record-setting pace again this year, with more than 60% of all low-income countries now under some form of financial penalty. It's the only thing between diplomacy and war, and as such has become the most important foreign policy tool in the U.S. arsenal, said Bill Reinsich, a former Commerce Department official and now the Scholl Chair in International Business at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a Washington-based think tank. And yet, Reinsich said, nobody in the government is sure this whole strategy is even working. Holy fucking hell, dude. Jesus fucking Christ. Start pounding things with this hammer. At the same time, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States was emerging as the world's unrivaled superpower, both financially and militarily. Governments and banks around the world would depend on the U.S. dollar, which remains the dominant currency on Earth. Today, the dollar buys access to the American economy, but also undergirds international trade, even when there is no connection to an American bank or business. Commodities like oil are priced globally against the greenback, and countries trading in their own currencies rely on dollars to complete international transactions. The United States is by far the most prolific sanctioning country and authority. Only 5 subs? That financial supremacy creates a risk for U.S. adversaries and even some allies. To deal in dollars, financial institutions must often borrow, however temporarily, from U.S. counterparts and comply with the rules of the U.S. government. That makes the Treasury Department, which regulates the U.S. financial system, the gatekeeper to the world's banking operations. And sanctions are at the gate. Treasury officials can impose sanctions on any foreign person, firm, or government they deem to be a threat to the U.S. economy, foreign policy, or national security. There's no requirement to accuse, much less convict, anyone of a specific crime. But the move makes it a crime to transact with the sanctions party. Coming under U.S. sanctions amounts to an indefinite ban from such much of the global economy. Initial targets, in addition to communist Cuba, were drug cartels in places like Mexico and Colombia and rogue regimes like Libya. What made Libya rogue? All that changed after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. Congress enacted legislation to compel financial institutions to maintain records of consumer transactions and hand them over to law enforcement. As the Treasury Department became a key player in the global war on terrorism, U.S. policymakers began to understand the power of the nation's financial hegemony. Experts urged a more sophisticated approach than the blood embargo used in Iraq. Smart sanctions, these advocates hoped, would be more precise, allowing maximum pressure by cutting off only malicious actors. Proof of concept soon materialized. In 2003, North Korea alarmed the world by withdrawing from the nuclear weapons treaty. Treasury officials under George W. Bush not only targeted the Macau bank that processed payments for Pyongyang, but also threatened any banks that traded with that one. North Korea officials howled, and the measures stymied Pyongyang's finances. The episode was a revelation for Treasury staffers. America appeared to have cowed a foe halfway around the world without firing a single bullet or spending a single penny. It was a pivotal moment, said Christian Patel, who served in senior roles at the Treasury's Department Financial Crimes Enforcement Network from 2015 to 2017, and now teaches sanctions policy and illicit finance at Syracuse University. Treasury got the go-ahead to start pounding things with this hammer. Every little thing we do is sanctions. The playbook soon shifted to include bigger targets and more aggressive enforcement. In 2010, President Barack Obama worked with Congress to approve sanctions designed to force Iran to give up its nuclear ambitions. The Justice Department began levying billions of dollars in fines on Western banks that defied Treasury prohibitions. These sanctions applied not just to Iran, but to firms trading with Iran, undercutting Tehran's links to international markets. Iranian leaders buckled, deciding to seek a nuclear deal that promised an end to financial isolation. This display of power led to a fresh demand. By Obama's second term, sanctions had been imposed on a growing list that included military officials of the Democratic Republic of Congo, suppliers of the Yemeni military, Libyan officials connected to Muammar Gaddafi, and after a brutal crackdown on civilian protesters in Syria, President Bashar al-Assad. By the way, they did the same crackdown on his Egyptian protesters. Is there any sanctions on the Egyptian fucking leaders? Congress got in on the act, flooding the State Department and White House with requests for sanctions that in some cases appeared intended to cut off foreign competition to home state industries. At a holiday party at Hotel Harrington in downtown Washington, Adam Suzbin, then director of OFAC, sang a song titled "Every Little Thing We Do Is Sanctions" to the tune of "Every Little Thing She Does Is Magic" by the Police. Some experts saw the surge as spiraling out of control. Smart sanctions were meant to be a buffet of choices where you fit the particular imposed sanction to the offense and vulnerability of the country, said George Lopez. Instead, policymakers walked into the buffet and said, "I'm going to pile everything on my plate." In 2014, Russia's illegal invasion and annexation of Crimea from Ukraine presented Treasury with a huge challenge. Countries like North Korea and Iran were viewed as serious national security threats, but nobody believed they were integral to modern finance. Now Treasury was forced to confront one of the 10 biggest economies in the world. A wrong move could set global markets reeling. Oh no, not my global markets! Not my global markets! No, not my global markets, guys! What about my global markets? No! You'd get requests and comments from seemingly every quarter of the government. Why have you not imposed sanctions on these people? What about these people? Said Adam M. Smith. Regardless if you were a Democrat or Republican, the thought process was always, why would you not continue to do this? Smith said. But government officials began to notice problems with the Treasury's complicated new regime. Sanctions on Russia targeting allies of President Vladimir Putin and state banks had no apparent effect on control of Crimea. European leaders grew angry over fines leveled on their banks. Wall Street power brokers started to grumble about the cost of complying with the dizzying new instructions. The number of sanctioned entities appeared to be growing too fast for OFAC to keep up. Nuance bred confusion. Requests for clarification poured in, and the number of lawsuits against the agency tripled. Turnover intensifies as the rising stakes allowed Treasury staffers to bolt for private sector paydays that could quadruple their earnings. Wow, what a good system we've built for ourselves. A more existential challenge emerged as well. The power of sanctions lay in denying foreign actors access to the dollar, but if sanctions make it risky to depend on dollars, nations may find other ways to trade. In March 2016, Obama Treasury Secretary Jack Lew warned publicly of sanctions overreach and the risk that their overuse could ultimately reduce our capability to use sanctions effectively. Actually, this is one of China's strategies. They want to form a international clearinghouse currency that they don't even control. Like China proposing alternative to dollar. China wants to ditch the dollar. The first such exchange, the Baotao Rare Earth Products Exchange, was started operating in 2014, is jointly owned by 14 major Chinese rare earth suppliers, and was explicitly set up, at least in part, to increase China's overall role in pricing rare earth products. To that end, China also launched two renminbi-denominated exchanges, oil futures in 2018 and copper futures in 2020 on the Shanghai International Energy Exchange. By establishing commodity exchanges across its industrial cities, China aims to boost the use and power of renminbi in global commodities pricing to establish an alternative global financial system that is less reliant on the almighty dollar. This effort also involves regional cooperation with China's neighbors and non-Western multilateral partnerships to develop regional currency arrangements and enhance the use of local currencies in international trade and investment. In China's telling, these strategies are less about offense, trying to dethrone the US dollar or replacing it in the global system, and more about defense, strengthening China's financial security and reducing its geo-economic vulnerabilities within the existing dollar-denominated global and financial system. Beijing wants to minimize its exposure to a potential dollar liquidity crunch and ensure its continued access to global capital markets even during times of geopolitical crisis. In other words, try to make itself immune to US sanctions. And chat, this is how we enter a multipolar world. And yet the incoming Trump administration again found its new uses for the financial weapon as it applied more sanctions than ever. As president, Donald Trump used sanctions as retribution in ways never conceived, ordering them, for instance, on officials with the International Criminal Court after it opened a war crimes investigation into the behavior of U.S. troops in Afghanistan. Hey, Biden could do that too after they charge Netanyahu with war crimes. Yay! The Trump administration also hit Venezuela with crippling sanctions, aiming to discredit the dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro and encourage an opposition movement. The penalties failed to oust Maduro and are now blamed for exacerbating one of the worst peacetime economic collapses in modern history. The abuse of this system is ridiculous, but it's not Treasury or OFAC's fault. They're good professionals who have all this political work being shoved on them. They want relief from this relentless, never-ending, you must sanction everybody in their system, sister, sometimes literally system, says Caleb McCary, who served as senior staffer to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and was the State Department's lead on Cuba policy during George W. Bush. It's way, way overdue used, and it's become out of control. Wow, I can't believe you made me do the thing that I do. And there, Joe Biden, Russia, Iran, China, Myanmar, and Belarus. Wow, great job, idiot. By the time of Biden's inauguration, a consensus has emerged among his transition team that something had to change. In the summer of 2021, 5 Treasury staffers worked on an internal draft proposing to restructure the sanction system. It ran roughly 40 pages. It would have represented the most substantial revamp of sanction policy in decades. Like the 3 previous administrations, Biden's team found the power difficult to give up. A billboard in Caracas blames the opposition for the harm caused by U.S. sanctions against Venezuela as the autocratic Nicolas Maduro prepares to secure a 3rd term as president in July elections. Oh yeah, man, the sanction, they blame the people that are directly responsible for the thing they did. How dictatorial of you. By the time Treasury released its 2021 sanctions review, the 40-page draft had dwindled to 8 pages and contained the earlier document's most toothless recommendations. 4 months later, Russian troops marched into Ukraine, and Biden unleashed an unprecedented volley of more than 6,000 sanctions in 2 years. Not only on Russia, the Biden administration penalized Israeli settlers in the West Bank. It's withdrawn this. It withdrew this immediately, like within a week. This isn't even true. I would actually call this a lie. Like, they literally lifted these sanctions. Yeah, here it is. There you go. May 29th. U.S. says Israeli banks don't have to close accounts of sanctioned settlers. Letter clarifying policy comes after several banks denied those sanctioned access to their assets. Infuriating Treasury chief who threatened to take revenge on the Palestinian Authority, source says. The U.S. informed Israel this week that Biden administration's sanctions against violent settlers are not intended to compel Israeli banks to close the accounts of targeted individuals. The clarification, sent in a letter from the U.S. Treasury Department to the Bank of Israel and obtained by the Times of Israel, is intended to cool anger from Israel's Treasury chief over the fact that sanctioned individuals have lost access to local banking services due to fears of violating the U.S. penalties. Several major banks froze the accounts of those slapped with sanctions by U.S. President Joe Biden's administration earlier this year. So you see how it lasted literally a week? Was I not correct? Isn't that amazing? Biden's, wow. U.S. sanctions fundraisers for extremist West Bank settlers. Wow. Lifted a month later. Pathetic. Former government officials in Afghanistan allege fentanyl dealers in Mexico and a North Macedonian spyware company. Meanwhile, sanctions that Biden had said he would ease, such as those imposed by Trump on Cuba, were largely maintained under pressure from Capitol Hill. So in other words, he kept Trump's sanctions on Cuba. What a fucking loser. And a loser is a loser, which is why he's a one-term president. Fucking loser. Last year, Treasury announced it had hired economists to staff a new division analyzing the economic impact of sanctions. Humanitarian groups have praised Biden's administrations to ensure that critical medical supplies and food can enter countries under sanctions. And some of the critics' worst fears have not materialized. The dollar remains the top reserve currency, at least for now. Sanctions are an important tool that can help promote our national security, but they should only be used as part of a broader foreign policy strategy. Current and former U.S. officials describe OFAC's workload as overwhelming, the agency inundated with tens of thousands of requests from the private sector. Guys, we should get some more requests. More requests for clarification. That would be a shame if OFAC got another 1,000 requests for clarification. Oh, man. I've got some ideas for businesses. I should start requesting some information. Some White House officials have outsourced national security questions to nonprofits as they brainstorm. In other words, that's incredible. In other words, American oligarch bribes In late 2022, senior White House advisors again held discussions about reforming U.S. sanctions, and closed-door talks that included Biden aides talked about the need to get guidelines for economic statecraft, including limiting the use of sanctions in moments when core international principles that underpin peace and security are under a threat. But those ideas were shelved. The mentality, almost a weird reflex in Washington, has just become, if something bad happens anywhere in the world, the U.S. is going to sanction some people, and that doesn't make sense, said Ben Rhodes, who served as Deputy National Security Advisor in the Obama administration. We don't think about the collateral damage of sanctions the same way we think about the collateral damage of war, but we should.
She has no idea who Mike is.
Mike. I don't know who you are. I don't know where you are. But you may want to start changing your ways. Change your ways. Or changing your